Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine. It is the first of the year of 2024. Happy New Year. It is the first week of January, and we have so much going on that we are going to talk about the week's hottest legal topics. And we are off to a great start. For goodness, we're going to talk today about immigration. Texas laws recently enacted regarding immigration and whether that is actually legal, the lawsuit that has been filed by the federal government against Texas, as well as the updates on the Trump cases, including the Colorado court that has the Colorado case that has been accepted by the Supreme Court for review, as well as the presidential immunity issue going through the Court of Appeals in D.C., and a couple other things along the way. We might hit the issue of the Harvard presidency, as well as, goodness, we've got a couple things up our sleeves. So if you're interested in the law and in politics, stay tuned with us through the exciting New Year's Legal Weekly Wine. I'm Virginia Tarani. I'm with Tarani Law LLC, because you never need a lawyer. Tell you do.
No, you do.
And I have with me the eminent professor and expert in the Constitution, the amending process, and constitutional law, Dr. John Vial, who's the dean of Middle Tennessee State University Honors College. Welcome back and Happy New Year.
And to you.
Thank you.
And our audience.
And our audience, yes.
And all those within the sound of our voice.
Within the sound of my voice. Exactly. No, it's very exciting. And for everyone, please hit like and subscribe so that you can see our channel, keep up to date with our recent news and our weekly news regarding law and politics, as well as to get it seen by other people who may appreciate the same topics and conversation that we're having. We are going to toast the new year and then get straight into our immigration discussion and then on to Trump. But have you brought some bubbly with you?
I have. I've never had it before. Celsius Sparkling Wild Berry energy drink.
Excellent.
I think this is the first energy drink other than Coke I've ever had. And I've had a couple sips and my foot is already going wild on me.
Then maybe just another sip or two.
I did not realize until I got it home that it only has 10 calories. So I don't usually go for diet kind of things, but it has a little bit of aftertaste, as these things sometimes do, but it's pretty tasty. Wild berry is
excellent.
My selection of today.
Well, I'm glad. And I also brought some bubbly. Mine is of the alcoholic sort, but that's okay. I have brought a cava, a rosé cava, usually from Spain, and I think this one is too. I am so terrible at pronunciation, so I will not inundate our listeners and our watchers.
What'd you do with the money?
I did not take Spanish. I would make more money.
Any better at French?
Yes. I would make more money with Spanish, especially being in D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. I swear I would make double what I do. And people who do have that skill are very valuable in this area.
Immigration law is a big deal.
It really is. And I've been told that many times, and still at the over 40 age, it is very hard for me to pick back up the language of French and to even learn a new language. So props to everyone who can. I have one friend who speaks like 5 to 6 different languages and is learning a 7th. It's amazing. Some people have that talent. We have the talent for the Constitution. Right?
So we hope.
Right? I mean, that was a resounding yes.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Well, cheers. Happy New Year. And we'll get started. Definitely very crisp. Almost a wake you up kind of thing. I don't have caffeine, but this is a good bubbly. All right, Dr. Vial, let's talk about this immigration issue. And thank you to our listener and our watcher who actually asked for us to speak about it. I think it's a great topic right now. It is, from what I can tell, a very novel issue. At least in terms of a state recently trying to enact laws regarding immigration. So what is your take as someone who knows the Constitution inside and out? What's reserved?
Let's give a little context,
please.
Which is, the United States we've often been called a nation of immigrants. We've been called a melting pot. We had very liberal immigration policies up through about the 1870s or 80s. Then we adopted a Chinese exclusion law. And then again in the 20s, we tended to expand that to Japan as well. And then, during the 30s and whatever, we're also somewhat restrictive. This is a worldwide problem right now. There are as many refugees in the world today, my understanding is, than there have ever been. And with a possible exception, maybe at the end of World War II, where you had a lot of displaced people in Europe. But,
Sure.
there have been wars in Syria, a lot of people fled Afghanistan. Latin America, you have both political repression,
Right.
you have gang violence, you have economic turmoil. I don't know if it doesn't make our problems any easier, but it's important to realize we're not the only country facing it. And what we do need to remember, it's easy to, what's the term? It's easier to make stereotypical judgments about other people's, especially if their color's a little different, if they're speaking a different language,
Sure.
whatever. But I think it's a rare person who immigrates to the United States with the purpose of raping or murdering American citizens, as is sometimes charged.
It seems more like a way to have a better life, a more hopeful promise.
Yeah. Now, that being said, there probably isn't room in the United States for everybody in the world who wants to come here. We have long considered ourselves, and I think in many ways we are a promised land, a land of economic opportunity, a land of freedom. If I were abroad, even if I were in a country that were moderately prosperous, I might think of coming to the United States to better my life. And there are processes for legal immigration, but it's almost like winning the lottery. It's not a very clear pattern. About the people that have the best luck in getting into the United States today are those who are relatives of an existing citizen. And this goes back to a law that was adopted, I believe, in 1965 during the Johnson administration. And that has turned out to almost upend the way. Prior to that, immigration was largely on the basis frankly, of race. We tended to prioritize Northern European as opposed to Southern European or African, Asian, or South American. But we're party to international agreements that offer asylum to people who are facing political persecution and threat of death. So if you came here and applied, if you applied for citizenship on the basis that you're in a very repressive regime and they've, jailed your parents and you're next on the list, you probably have a good chance of being here.
Right.
But if you come and, whether this is fair or not, if you're coming here because you live in a country where gang violence, let's say you live in Haiti and gangs are ruling the streets,
El Salvador,
killing people, kidnapping people, robbing people, and you want to come here for a better life, you're not entitled to under international amnesty law. You would be if you were a result of political oppression, but not simply for economic or violence. So, it's very easy, and I don't know what I would do. It's very easy to say, the obvious argument against the illegal immigrants is if you use that terminology, is they're illegal.
Right.
They've done something illegally. Well, I shouldn't confess, but I did something illegal this morning.
Oh, no.
I was driving 62 in a 55-mile-an-hour zone. And frankly, I had less warrant for doing that than many people would have for picking up their families and trying to get them out of a war zone.
Sure.
Or, I couldn't provide support for my family. And so let's go to America. That's the land of opportunity. So it's really tricky. But part of the problem is, the question is, and I have my thoughts on it, and I hope I'm wrong, but my impression is that in some ways, the people who are screaming the loudest about illegal immigration want to continue screaming. They do not want to catch the car and stop illegal immigration because it's such a good issue for them. And so you don't get a lot of cooperation between the executive branch and the legislative branch as to what should be done. So you have, it's too good an issue. Why give it up?
Right.
So, are they
the
acting in good faith? I'm not really sure. Now, where you see this right now, you see it in two places. And one you've already mentioned.
Texas.
So Texas has adopted a law that says it's now a violation of state law to enter Texas illegally.
Criminal violation. It's not even a civil fine.
Now, there's all kinds of problems with that. The major one is Arizona versus United States. The Supreme Court decided a decade or so ago that the area of naturalization and immigration is a matter for Congress, that they have preempted the field, sort of like certain areas of interstate commerce. And so in Arizona, they ruled no, Arizona can't make it a separate offense. Now, what Texas is saying here is, well, that would ordinarily be true, but the national government isn't enforcing its own laws. That's their argument.
So that's why they're saying this is different.
Right. So what choice do we have? Now, what's very fascinating, and this, you may have a 3-hour program here if you get me on this podium for too long. But right now, the House of Representatives is starting an impeachment procedure against Alejandro Mayorkas,
right?
Who is heads
Homeland Security.
National. And so they're saying he's to blame. He's not enforcing the law. Well, I don't know the ins and outs of this, but I do know that he is directly responsible to Joe Biden. And if Joe Biden doesn't think he's following the law, Joe Biden can fire him in a New York minute.
Because he's part of the executive branch.
He's part of the executive branch. And what is happening here, clearly there is not going to be a 2/3 majority in the Senate, unless we find out that, Mayorkas, is using immigrants as slave labor on a farm somewhere that we don't know about.
Or taking bribes or something to that effect.
Yeah, taking bribes or, something which there's no evidence of. But, it takes 2/3 to convict in the Senate.
For impeachment, specifically.
Pardon?
Specifically for impeachment.
I'm sorry, to convict it. If he were to be impeached by a majority of the House, it would require 2/3 majority in the Senate, which you're not going to get with the Senate almost evenly split. Democrats are not going to vote for it any more than Republicans were willing to vote for the impeachment of Donald Trump. And to me, and you have the same thing here now with the president. So Republicans are launching an official investigation of the president. Why? Not because they have any. Now, is there evidence against Hunter Biden? There seems
Absolutely.
to be. Did he violate the law? Probably he did. He's been indicted. Has there been a connection shown to this date between Biden's offenses or alleged offenses and those of his son? None that I know of.
None publicly known.
Right. Mm-hmm. And, if you fish long, if you put out a line of even it doesn't have a worm on it, a curious fish might get entangled in it. You might just come up with something, but that's not the way that law works. And it's not the way the impeachment process is going to work. As far as I can tell, it's just sort of Republicans and Democrats would do the same thing in their own situation. But they're saying we're going to minimize these 2 impeachments of Trump by launching some impeachments of our own. And we'll just show that it's a political mechanism. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean...
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions. Let me start with the impeachment and then go back to Texas, but all still within this immigration field. So with the executive branch, with Mayorkas, we've got him appointed to a cabinet seat by the executive.
Right.
Can we actually impeach a cabinet member?
Yes. Although I believe it's the last time we tried to do so was like 1876, 1875, somewhere along in there. So typically, I mean, can you? Yes. Now, the more interesting question is, can you impeach a member of Congress? And the weight of opinion says no.
There are other procedures, but not impeachment.
That's right. They can, as we saw in New York,
with Santos,
they expelled a member on their own. So they have. So it's generally thought that, and this goes to an issue that comes up in the Trump case, that members of the Congress are not officers of the United States in the same way that members of the executive branch or the military are officers of the United States.
Okay, so we can impeach him, but what are the articles of impeachment? What can he be impeached for?
Okay, the same thing as anyone else. Treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors, which is a more difficult term of art, which includes but may not be limited to actual criminal offenses.
Okay.
In this case, apparently their argument is that he is not enforcing the laws that Congress has adopted. I would say Congress really hasn't adopted very many effective laws on the subject, and they're just sort of using him as, it's just sort of a way of drawing attention to an issue and embarrassing him.
But in that case, I mean, I live in Maryland, and we've had many issues over the past decade of, well, are certain counties going to enforce rules of ICE? Are we going to enforce federal issues of immigration or drugs? Exactly.
And one of the things that the Texas governor plays on. He says, you have these cities who say they're not going to follow the law. Great. We're going to busload our people there. Now, I have strong opinions about this that date back to my reading in the junior year of college of Immanuel Kant.
Oh, interesting.
He talks about the kingdom of ends, that you should not be using persons as means rather than treating them as human beings, and to load people on buses or planes, particularly if you do so, which appears to be the case in Florida, in false pretenses in order to make a political point, is really a sad political move, my judgment. And I think Immanuel Kant would agree with me.
I believe he would, based on my limited knowledge of philosophy.
By the way, if you want to study philosophy, leave him a little down the road. When you first go to read him, it presents quite a bit of a challenge.
Well, not like any of the others are that much more easy.
Well, he's particularly peck-lucid, is it, or not peck-lucid?
Great vocabulary word. All right, so in going back to the Texas law specifically, so my understanding is the federal government, the Department of Justice, has sued Texas. They have gone after the state saying these are illegal or unconstitutional rules.
And from the governor of Texas's standpoint, that's probably fine. That's exactly what he wants.
To bring attention.
Let the national government take the blame. And, to be a little sympathetic to him, it is a little easier for me sitting in Tennessee and maybe for you in Maryland to say,
we're not at the border.
Right. We're not there. We don't have undocumented non-citizens coming through our yards and coming into our towns. If you're lower into the economic spectrum. Now, part of the problem, by the way, is my understanding is if they come in, through illegally, they are not permitted. They're given a hearing, which often is 2 to 3 years in advance. We don't have enough judges doing that. But in the meantime, they're not supposed to work. So, imagine dumping all these people in a city and telling them they just got to wait there for 2 or 3 years. Well, who's going to take care of them? Well, city of New York's going to take care, or Boston or Colorado. They're going to take the costs that arguably come from inadequate national policies. So I have some sympathy with these governors, but again, it doesn't extend to, it was like, I had some sympathy when Trump was was president and we had so many people coming from the border that we decided we're going to separate women and children. But the last time I remember doing that in American history was pre-Civil War, where you
Okay.
could sell a slave's children out from under them. And I don't think that's the kind of image that America wants to have.
Sure.
And I don't think it's a moral policy.
And in going, I'm not trying to ignore you. I'm absolutely listening, but I wanted to make sure I was looking up our handy guide to the Constitution. And as I understand it, I wanted to make sure I was in the right section and the right language. But as the expert, let me run this by you. As I understand it, you were saying earlier that the Congress has the authority
Article 1,
over.
Section 8 is
there
where
we
you should be
go. Okay,
looking.
good.
Yeah.
And where I'm headed is, so we've got the power to lay and collect taxes. So the actual explicit powers listed in the Constitution for Congress.
Enumerated powers.
Enumerated powers includes taxes, impose excises, borrow money and credit, regulate commerce with foreign nations. And then we have this other clause of to establish a uniform rule of naturalization.
Right.
So that seems to me very clear that this is a power regulated or provided specifically to Congress, the federal Congress.
The trick there, now we have the Arizona case, which would imply that's the interpretation, but there are some enumerated powers of Congress which are known as concurrent powers. So the power of taxation is one.
That
Not
the
only
states
can
can
Uncle Sam
also
tax me, but so can the state of Tennessee. So this arguably could be an area where you would have a degree of regulation by both, but the national government is arguing, and I mean, there's certainly good arguments for saying there ought to be a uniform national policy. You should be able to, come in free if you come in the port of New York and be thrown in jail if you come through Texas or vice versa.
Okay. So, yeah. And I mean, that also gets us to the supremacy clause, right? Which is a lot of this, is that the federal rules are supposed to be the supreme law of the land.
Right. Well, the Constitution and federal laws and treaties made thereunder are the supreme law of the land. That's right.
Well, let's talk real quick about treaties. This is
Okay.
We're at least on the same issue of foreign governments and for rules among foreign powers and how we're dealing with that. So we also had another listener recently who asked us about treaties. And since we're in the text of the Constitution, I think this is a perfect place to say, okay, what are the rules then for the executive? We've got the legislative branch, which is over naturalization, over immigration.
Okay.
But according to the executive powers, the treaties, I believe the power to make treaties, at least, is with the president. Is that correct?
You're halfway there.
Okay.
President negotiates treaties, makes treaties, takes 2/3 of the Senate to approve a treaty. Now,
how to get out of a treaty?
Well, okay, but it's even more complicated than that.
Okay.
But how? I just had it. Okay,
let me get the Constitution
we're going
back
too
up.
fast today.
Yeah, I'm jumping.
Well, right. What I was going to say is there are agreements, so-called particularly executive agreements, that are often made under the authority of congressional laws, which do not require a 2/3 majority of the Senate. And so sometimes the line between what is a treaty and what is not very clear. But I think where you're headed is there is concern, well, or maybe some people support it. I certainly don't. But since the end of World War II, and contrary, by the way, to the advice of our first president, who urged us to avoid entangling alliances, one of the keys to national security, particularly since World War II on, has been the treaty that we entered, the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, basically with the nations of Western Europe. It's now expanded some, but that an attack on one would be considered an attack on the other, on all. And this operates according to the principle of deterrence. The notion is, Russia might attack Poland if they thought it was only their power versus Poland, but
By
if they thought it
themselves.
was their power versus all the nations of Western Europe, they would be less likely to attack. And arguably, this has preserved peace in Western Europe for close to 100, well, since 1945, and
Sure.
or thereabouts. It's been a long time before we have had, well, since the Soviet Union, except for Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is not a member. It is an aspiring member, but it's not a current member of NATO. But it's worked pretty well. But one of Trump's critiques, and this goes back to his first election, was that he doesn't think the European allies have paid their fair share. We have paid more money per citizen, I believe, than they have for defense, which he says is arguably that it's their defense, they ought to be paying for it.
It's their land. It's sure.
Right. The wider view is that peace in Europe is to all our interests. We've been involved in 2 world wars, which have required great expenditures of blood and treasure. We don't ever want that happening again. So the question has become, if Trump were reelected, he still seems to be, and particularly since the attack by Russia on Ukraine,
Right.
he seems to think the best thing to do is get out of Europe, don't have anything to do with it, just let the chips fall where they may. So would he have the power as a president to withdraw us from NATO? My understanding is yes. Now, I'm not saying I favor it. I don't favor it. I think it would be disastrous. But there is a precedent, and forgive me for not calling it immediately to mind. It may be Carter versus U.S.
The fact that you know any of these case names off the top of your head is impressive itself.
No, not as long as I've been teaching. But there is a case that said essentially that actually the Supreme Court, it's more ambiguous.
Okay.
So the Supreme Court, if I remember, decided it was a political question as to whether the president could terminate. It was up to Congress and the president to sort it out. It wasn't up to the courts. That's my recollection.
And that was with Carter?
If I remember, it was like a 4-3, or there were very close decisions. So, but it's possible. Well, let's do it this way. The president can only appoint members of the cabinet and the court.
Okay.
Well, stick to the cabinet. He can only appoint cabinet officers with the advice and consent of the Senate.
Right.
And
this is under Article 2.
Clear precedents establish that the president can fire a cabinet officer without the consent of the Senate. And so the parallel situation would be if the president has negotiated a treaty with Senate consent, he ought to be able, as he would with a cabinet appointee, to reject him on that. But that's the current issue. And it may be, there seem to be some efforts in Congress right now, particularly if Trump were to be reelected, to affirm up front that we're not giving him the unilateral authority to exit from a treaty as consequential as NATO. And then the court would have to decide again, is this a political question? What do we do if one says we have a treaty and the other says we don't?
Okay.
Now, we don't know for sure that Trump would withdraw. So I don't know that that's officially part of his campaign, but he certainly continues to gripe that, if we haven't sent, there's an authorization bill right now to renew our support for Ukraine. And many Republicans are saying we don't want to. That's their fight. That's not our fight. The argument NATO would give, the argument from NATO is if European countries start dropping
protecting you
under Russian domination, that could be a threat not only to them but also to us.
Okay. Wow. Okay, so we've gotten immigration.
Yep.
We've gotten foreign treaties.
Maybe we should run for office.
Maybe
all
we
these
should.
Solutions that we're offering.
That's right. You know, the closest I've ever come is when I was working at the Commonwealth of Newport News. I had a couple of my law enforcement friends who wrote me into one of the ballots. It never went anywhere, but that was the closest I ever came to politics other than these comments.
I think I had a former student who claimed that he once, you may remember him, who claimed that he once wrote my name in on a ballot.
I believe I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. He subsequently moved to China. So.
Yes, he did. So we've gotten those, and we should consider running. But in the meantime, we'll continue our commentary of the laws. So we have a brief update, two brief updates on the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment regarding disqualification of Trump, and then the privileges and immunity appeal. So let's talk about those before we end for today.
Okay.
What's that?
Colorado and Maine?
Yes.
You're going to go there?
Yes, let's talk about Colorado and Maine.
Okay, so two states have now disbarred, well, they have and then they've stayed the disbarment, but two states have said that Trump is ineligible to run as a Republican nominee in the presidential primary.
Right.
On the basis that he aided an insurrection under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment that we've talked about on this show many times. And the Supreme Court has decided to hear it because while you have two states who have said he's disbarred here, you have others who have said either for prudential reasons or now, and the laws vary, by the way.
Per state.
Some states tend to give greater scrutiny to candidates than others do, but the Supreme Court obviously seems concerned. And what's interesting, of course, is you have predominantly Republican court right now, and one Republican solution would actually be just let it stay that way. We have a federal system. If some states decide he qualifies in their state and others don't, states have a role in federal elections. We ought to leave it at that. But I don't think it's going to go there. And the reason is, I mean, there are several questions that come into play, and we've talked about some of them. One is the 14th Amendment applies to officers of the United States. And as strange as it sounds, some people don't think the office of the president is an office under the United States.
Which is the original district court judge for the Colorado case.
That's right. Well,
that was her ruling.
It was actually a majority on that. That's right. The judge said, we think he was an insurrectionist, but we don't believe he was an officer of the United States.
Right.
Now, there are others, by the way, who say, we don't think he took an oath to support the Constitution. The oath that he took was to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution.
Which is specifically written in the Constitution as his oath.
In my judgment, that's a bogus argument. I mean, I can't think of any synonyms that would come any closer to support than preserve, protect, and defend. So I don't think those arguments are going to work, but they're out there. But I think the primary argument becomes, has the president been given due process in establishing that he, in fact, was an insurrectionist? Right. He's never been convicted of it. Does it require a criminal conviction?
Right.
Some people would say no, because you don't necessarily have a right to appear on a ballot. It's not a criminal punishment if you withhold access to it. But somebody has to sort this out, and that's what the Supreme Court gets paid to do.
But isn't there, in the Constitution, isn't there a right not only to vote, but to have access to the ballot as a political candidate?
I don't know where it would be. I mean,
here I am. I'm saying something that I think is wise.
And I'm going to be embarrassed if a con law scholar calls up and says, "You idiot! Here's where it is." I mean, we certainly, actually, the Constitution, if you want to shock people, the Constitution doesn't specifically guarantee the right to vote. Right. The Constitution prohibits discrimination in voting on the basis of race or sex or age above the age of 18. but it doesn't have an affirmative guarantee in the text of the right to vote. And so given that it doesn't, I don't think there's an actual. Now, one could argue, here you could argue that if you are 35 years of age, natural born, and 14 years a resident of the United States, that you would be entitled to run for president because there are the qualifications. But that's sort of an indirect way. What the argument here is, well, Section 3 has an additional qualification in effect, which is you're not entitled to run if you have been either part of an insurrection or you've given aid or comfort to an insurrection. So there's one part of the argument in Colorado. The lower courts rely very heavily on testimony, and if there are any sociologists listening, I appreciate you. I really do. But there are a lot of arguments that are based on the testimony of a single professor at Chapman University. Mm-hmm. And I think I just can't help but wonder, that's where John Eastman is from, and I just can't help from wondering if one side isn't reveling in finding somebody from Chapman who basically, he interprets political rhetoric, and he's come to the conclusion effectively that Donald Trump has been dog whistling to his supporters to go out and do, when he said, we got to fight like hell, we'll never take our country back, that he meant exactly, that his supporters knew when he said stand by and stand down and stand by. When he told that to the Proud Boys, that was his way of saying, show up and do damage. There's a lot of reliance on this testimony from a sociologist as to what this means. Right. And again, not to put down sociologists, but what does that have to do with interpreting the 14th Amendment?
Sure.
So I think there's some real issues in the case in terms of, what's the burden of proof? Does it have to be uniform from one state to another? Is the president entitled to due process in a case like this? And what does due process exactly involve? Does it mean he has to be convicted, or does it only mean that you make a good faith judgment as to whether he was or wasn't an insurrectionist? So that, there are going to be some fun cases to watch.
Well, so now Maine is a little bit different. Maine has
they're the
come
Secretary
in.
of State
Exactly.
has made the judgment. It hasn't gone to a court. And God bless her, as far as I can tell. She doesn't seem, the interviews that I've seen, she seems to say, I didn't necessarily want this job. They made me Secretary of State.
Right.
Republican voters said, we don't think Trump should be on the ballot. It was my duty to make a judgment, and I've made it. I've stayed it until it can get to a higher court to decide, but I just did my duty. I think that's a pretty credible position.
Now, with the Supreme Court review, will the Maine decision be considered, or will it just be limited to Colorado?
I think Colorado and Maine are both, they've accepted both. Am I mistaken on that?
And that's what I don't know. So that would be fantastic if they did.
It's literally a one paragraph. It's okay. If it were 100 pages, I would have read it.
Right, we read those.
Yeah, I read those.
We missed the little ones, but we got the big ones.
Well, it literally is, we agree to hear this case. And I think it involves both. I don't think it makes much difference. I think whatever they decide would end up being considered good law in these and in other states. But it'll be a consequential decision. A lot of people are comparing it.
Yes.
And one of the comparing it to Bush versus Gore versus 2000. But one of the interesting arguments that Trump has made is that the 14th Amendment doesn't prevent you from running for office. It prevents you from taking office, which would then push it back. If he were to win office, then you'd have another Bush versus Gore in 2024. Well, he was elected. Does that mean, the people have spoken, or is the Constitution still supreme over what the current majority of the people or the Electoral College might decide?
Well, I worry that we're going to have 3 different time periods. that we're going to have this one, which is specifically related to the primaries.
Right, and
then we'll get
caucuses
another
start next
one.
week.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'll get another one for the actual election. Can he be on the full election ballot versus just the primaries?
Right.
And then if he wins or if he doesn't win,
Right.
I feel like it's a 3-part series.
Yeah, and I think it, in that respect, I think it would be wise if the Supreme Court, could give guidance on this and do it early.
But can they? Because
Sure.
the Supreme Court can't give advisory opinions. And those are opinions about things that haven't happened yet. They have to take up cases
but they
and
can engage in
controversies.
obiter dicta. That they can, in their reasoning of the decision, they can show you enough about what they're thinking that a prudent person would know, here's how they're going to decide next time. Now,
Okay.
things can still change between now and then. But I think they will probably. I don't like to predict court decisions here. The easiest thing to do would be to do what the Colorado lower court did and simply declare that he's not an officer, so it doesn't apply. But I think in some ways that's the least satisfactory. Mm-hmm. The notion that you can be. You hold the highest office in the land and you're still not considered an officer of the United States. That's almost like Alice in Wonderland kind of thinking to me.
Well, the first time you and I started talking about it, months ago, when the issue first came up, I remember you telling me that argument of there's this other argument. I was like, hey. I don't understand. The initial reaction is this seems ludicrous.
Well, it's a very textualist-based argument.
Yeah.
But it seems to defy the common sense of the matter.
Right. The letter, but not the spirit of the law.
It seems like the spirit, that may be a good way of phrasing.
Yeah. Okay, so let's head to the secondary topic of Trump, and then I want to get to the books that you've been reading that I think are great for our recommended listeners.
That's right. We need
read.
To get people reading early in the year.
Exactly. Good. A great New Year's resolution to read more. And we've got just the books for you. But before we get there, let's talk. I know you have been especially excited about. To talk about this appeal, the D.C. appeal regarding presidential immunity.
Okay. So the president is claiming that anything within the outward limits of his official acts as president are immune from criminal prosecution.
And this is specifically in regard to the D.C. federal case by Jack Smith.
Right. And as it turns out, to my knowledge, I think I'm right on this, the Supreme Court has never decided whether a president has criminal immunity. Now, Trump's attorneys say this must mean that he does, because we haven't had a case in 200 years plus where we prosecuted a president.
Right. And
now, the response, of course, is we've never had a case in 200 years where we've had a president who is in 5 different courtrooms even as we speak.
Right.
But part of the argument, of course, now it's not an actual, the argument relates to speech. When Trump addresses his supporters about the election, and maybe even says untruths or half-truths, he may be protected by the First Amendment unless the speech is considered an incitement to imminent, lawless, violent action.
Which applies to any of us.
It applies to any of us. That's right. But he would say, and he goes on to say, any calls that he made to state officials about the election, that was part of his job as president in ensuring electoral accountability. Instead
of just doing it for
his
personal
interest. Prosecutors say, no, it's not the duty of a president to run for re-election. When he does this, it's like, I think we've talked about this before. When a sitting president goes to give a speech, if he gives a speech on national issues, the government pays for it. If he's running for president, and he's going to accept a presidential nomination, he pays for it.
They don't fund his television ads.
That's right. And so the question here is, I mean, first we'd have to decide, did he commit a crime?
Right.
But which Smith says that he did. Now the question is he immune because he did it when he was president?
Right.
And I think unrealistically, the president's parties are saying he has absolute immunity
for whatever he does during office,
which would include rape, murder, armed robbery, anything else you could think of.
Right, becoming dictator.
You could literally
Biden could now do whatever he
go
wanted.
into the House of Representatives, shoot the Speaker of the House, and say, this was within the ambit of my duties because I'm in charge of dealing with the legislature, and I've just done it.
Right, and so, that's what I feel is a little bit handed. I don't know, tongue in cheek maybe is the best thing to say is, well, why would Trump or anybody stand for Biden coming and doing whatever he wanted, claiming he's president and he can do whatever he wants?
To Republicans, you're giving the same kind of immunity to Democrats. Absolutely.
We don't want to be president. We can be lord over the country.
I don't know.
I can do whatever I wanted.
If we go back to philosophy, it would be a curse to be tempted. What is it? The Lord of the Rings. Yeah. You're going after the ring that makes you invisible because then you can do no wrong. Well,
right.
You really want to be in that moral position. You're paving the road to hell for yourself.
Right.
So probably we don't. But here's the beauty.
Yeah.
So in this brief,
the legal brief.
Okay, this is Trump's brief on January the 2nd of 2024. So I'm going to read it to you because you can hardly believe it if you don't. Let's see. The government's brief amidst the vigorous disputes and questions about the actual outcome of the 2020 presidential election. So they're still arguing, as Trump is, that the 2020 election went to him. And by the way, I got to stop here.
Okay.
There's the most fascinating argument that's been raised lately that Trump is ineligible to run for office because, according to him, he's already been elected twice. And you can only have 2 terms.
Okay, I like that argument. That's clever.
I mean, it's not going to go anywhere, but I like it. Okay. So the government's brief amidst the vigorous disputes that date back to November 20th to November 2020, continue to this day in our nation's political discourse and are based on extensive information about widespread fraud and irregularities in the 2020 election. Now, citation.
Seems like a regular argument, one he continues
here's the citation.
To make.
I'm reading from you. I want people to know I'm reading. Okay. CEG, for example. Donald J. Trump at The Real Donald Trump, True Social, date January 2nd, 2024. The day they're filing the brief, they're citing arguments that Trump is making on social media regarding this, which in turn cites an anonymous election report. Now, so people will know, and I think they do, there were over 60 cases that Trump and Trump's people filed
throughout the U.S.
Right, throughout the United States over election irregularities. There may have been one that it temporarily did something for him. Overwhelmingly, they said, no, there's no evidence of widespread fraud.
We have not found any
Giuliani is being sued, right, for
defamation.
Right, for defamation for alleging fraud. Fox News lost 725
million.
Yeah, millions or billions.
Right?
They're all the same to a college professor.
Right, a lot of money.
Or a member of Congress, right? In any case, as my favorite term, apparently for using, this is really crazy. That the president is essentially citing himself to bolster an argument that he is making in this particular case. I just do not see. Now, should courts be reluctant to accept frivolous cases against the president for illegal activities? Absolutely.
Yes.
In the same way that I'm just making an argument earlier that you should not be able, from what I know, to impeach the head of immigration and naturalization for not carrying out policies that are unclear or that the president doesn't want him to carry out.
Right.
So should you treat the president as an ordinary person anytime somebody has a grudge? Should you criminalize activity that's not activity and blame the president? Absolutely not. He's entitled, and he already has wide immunity from civil cases.
Right.
U.S. versus the Fitzgerald case has basically said if he's doing it within the scope of, he has to exercise wide discretion. And even when it's sometimes unfair, if he has the right to fire somebody, he has the right to fire somebody. But I really think of all the issues out there. Now, I think the weakest, the case that the president has right now is this documents case.
The one in Florida.
I don't see any reason. I have seen no argument that would justify an ex-president in keeping and hiding
and distributing
and possibly sharing classified information. But the most consequential argument, I think, of all the arguments right now is, can a president, and we still have to establish whether he has or not, but if the evidence shows that he engaged in an attempt to overthrow an election, is he going to be responsible for it or not? And if he's not, let's not call ourselves a democracy. Let's not call ourselves a republic. Or if we want to call it, I don't know, a banana republic. That's sort of a insult to banana republics, isn't it?
Right.
I don't know if I want to go there. But nonetheless,
yeah,
that's where we are.
I had and speaking, a very random statement, and completely not legal, but I've been watching I love British mysteries and dramas. Yes. And I've been watching a Canadian one, and one of my favorite phrases that has come out of that, and you're saying in any case, I've heard a lot of ones saying, be that as it may.
Yes, so, very similar term.
Be that as it may. So that's
like a good song.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure. We'll do that next.
Okay.
And in all of our
singing,
free team.
Or maybe the piano playing.
I'll play the piano. You don't want to hear me sing anymore. Okay, so let's talk about the New Year's resolutions in the books for what we're reading, especially you, and how it applies to the subjects that we're talking about today.
You promised one other thing, so I'm going to tie that in the first book. We'll talk just a little bit about Claudine Gray.
Yes, Harvard.
So we've had three people, three college presidents.
So much is going on this year, and it's only how many days in?
So three presidents were college presidents, recall, before Congress. They all gave squishy answers to whether students could advocate genocide and not be punished. Right. And two of them are now gone. One of whom is Claudine Gray, the head of Harvard. Now, her case is complicated by allegations of plagiarism, that she did not
that was the additional
credit some sources. And I frankly don't. My initial judgment is that she was sort of sloppy, but maybe not malicious. I'm not sure. But one of the books that relates to that indirectly is I'm reading or just finished this book called The Canceling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Ricky Schlott. They both work for FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And it's a free speech group, and they cut at both sides. They think that, for example, what's happening in Florida with the state trying to control state curricula, that violates academic freedom.
Sure.
But they also believe that many of the elite liberal institutions, many of your Ivy Leagues, often become places where people are afraid to express any opinion that isn't sort of the majority consensus. And that what they say, and I think the part that I like most, is they say, before we ever had a law of the First Amendment, we had a culture. of First Amendment values. And the law can only do so much. And it's important to call out people on both the right or the left to try to establish orthodoxy as to what can be spoken, what can be discussed in classrooms. Now, obviously, we have a little bit more leeway when it comes to K through 12 education.
Sure.
Parents deserve an input into what their children are taught, but particularly at the college level, there's one of the things I got out of this book that I went back to relook at. There's a statement known as a Chicago Statement, which was a Chicago Statement, or is it named after the person? I should know because I just wrote an essay on it. But in 1968, 67 or 68, they published a policy which basically said the University of Chicago is not, as an administration, going to take political positions unless they directly relate to education. We will serve as a forum for students and professors to say whatever they want on whatever side, but we're not going to choose for our students and faculty what should be orthodox. And this comes across very well in The Canceling the American Mind. Another book that we're approaching, I hope everybody knows this, we are approaching the semi-quincentennial. I thought it was going to be called the sextennial, but 2026, if I live that long, we will be celebrating the 250th anniversary of American independence.
Maybe you can retire then.
I don't know. I'm going to be able to go on the gases from this for at least another year or two beyond that. But one of the great terms that came out of the Declaration of Independence, about which I have an encyclopedia, are the meaning of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is a book by Peter Moore. It's a very eclectic book. It talks about Benjamin Franklin. It talks about printers in New York and printers in the United States, printers in Britain. Talks about Thomas Paine. But I got to tell there's just one wonderful story here, okay? So, anonymous speech. Have we ever talked about that on the program?
I don't think we have.
Okay.
I believe it's a new topic for us.
Okay, so the Supreme Court has decided that anonymous speech is protected by the First Amendment. Now, to be careful, this doesn't mean you necessarily that you have the right anonymously to accuse somebody of murder or adultery who hasn't committed murder or adultery, libels.
It's still slander and defamation.
But particularly in early America, most people wrote under pseudonyms. Most famous work in American political history is close to it is the Federalist Papers, which were written under the name of Publius. John Dickinson of Delaware, Pennsylvania, used to write under the name The Federal Farmer. But nobody was better at this than Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, of course, spent many years in England, and Linda and I got to visit the house where he stayed. Wonderful experience when we were just in London. And so at the time when there is a dispute between the United States and Britain over parliamentary sovereignty, because Parliament had the power to tax the colonies. And of course, the colonies are saying no, because we're not represented in Parliament. No taxation without representation.
Sure.
So the argument is going back and forth, and Franklin's trying to uphold the colonial side. So he writes this letter to the newspaper, and he writes this story, which says, and it's convoluted here, but England and Prussia had been allied in a war against France, but at the end of the war, the Prussians didn't feel they had been treated very well. So according to this story, news from foreign parts, Frederick II of Prussia is very upset with England. And he looks back and he finds out that most of England was originally populated by the Germans, and they have never received any recompense from this. And so the story goes that he is considering levying a tax on the people of England, and he wants all the merchants to come to this Prussian city and register and whatever. And Benjamin Franklin is at the equivalent of a cocktail party. with these
Okay.
highfalutin people. And one of them brings in the news and he says, look at this story. And they begin reading, and one says, by God, it's time for us to do something in response. We got to raise an army of our own. And then one of them starts laughing and he says, by jiggity, he says, I think the Americans have pulled one over on us again. And they all began laughing about this. And none of them realized that the person who wrote it is sitting there or standing there in the room at the time.
Oh, how
And
funny.
he's just going wild with, this is really effective. I got somebody's attention and they don't know who did it. So if you like rollicking stories like that, that's in this book. And then
the third one.
The third one, and these have all been good reads, kept me busy over the holiday. Matthew Martins, who was a former clerk for Chief Justice Rehnquist, who is now, I believe, he's been both a prosecuting and a defense attorney, a Christian. He's wrote something called Reforming Criminal Justice, a Christian Proposal. And he deals, you would like this a lot, particularly having been
one of my
both
next
a prosecutor and a defense attorney. But he argues that in subtle ways, the law is often biased in a way that's against Christian principles. And he's particularly concerned, I'll pick out two areas. He's particularly concerned about imposition of the death penalty. Turns out, if you're Black and you've committed a capital offense against a white person, you're like 45 times more likely to be convicted than if you killed a Black person. And other disparities that have come out. But the other one that he mentions that I've certainly known about and given thought to, but maybe didn't fully realize the extent of the possible injustice, he's really concerned about plea bargaining. And he's not so concerned, and plea bargaining, of course, is where the prosecution offers to lower the charges, in effect, for a guilty plea.
Or the sentence, or both.
Right. And this expedites criminal justice. If everybody went to a full trial, would be terribly expensive to do. But on the other hand, there's a coercive element here. And that is, and we know from history that people sometimes plead guilty, so you're up for the death penalty. And they say, well, if you confess, we'll only give you 20 years in jail.
Right. We'll save your life.
What if you really didn't commit murder? You got a chance to avoid the death penalty. That is fairly coercive.
Yes.
And we've had cases where subsequently evidence has come back and said, we now know that person wasn't guilty, but they confessed to it. Well, why did they confess? Because the law was putting a thumb on the scale. And of course, it's a thumb that's more likely to fall on people who are disenfranchised, people who are poor, people who have appointed, the other thing they point out is that while, since Gideon versus Wainwright, 1963, I think it is, while there is now a guarantee of counsel, there's not necessarily a guarantee of effective counsel.
There's supposed to be.
If you look at the typical prosecuting attorney versus defense attorney that's appointed, prosecuting attorneys make more. They have better chance for promotion than
absolutely.
Others. And so again, it's an example possibly of the state putting the thumb on the scale, maybe for reasons of efficiency, frugality, and whatever. But these are not necessarily up to the standards of biblical justice.
Sure.
And he makes one of the fascinating theological arguments, and I don't know that law seems like law would be enough, but he makes an interesting theological argument, which is that the primary theme of the Bible is love, and that acts of justice are actually acts of love. You're showing love to a victim's family if you value the crime against them enough to punish the perpetrator.
Sure.
And often, particularly evangelical Christians, which is where I've been most of my life, although the term now bothers me a little bit, but they often make sort of a harsh line of division between God's law and God's justice, almost as though you have two different gods at, at war with one another. And he argues, no, these are really, they're the same ball of wax. And so I think anybody who, who's interested, this is by Crossway, which I believe is a religious publisher, but, this is a person with a law degree, again, very well qualified. I think this is his first book. And by the way, the other book I should mention, the Lukanov.
Oh, a fourth one.
The Cant's, no, the going back.
The original one, the canceling. Yeah.
He wrote a previous book, or I believe he co-authored a previous book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And the argument there was that, maybe sometimes we're, and he's obviously opposed to bullying and that sort of thing, but maybe sometimes we set ourselves up as a little too sensitive, and maybe the better thing sometimes is, okay, you're offended by what somebody says, respond to it with a reasonable argument.
Sure.
Don't just walk off the stage and say, well, I'm not going to talk to somebody who I think's a racist, or I think's a Democrat or Republican or whatever, whatever your term of art is. And then he makes a good case for saying part particularly of collegiate education should be to be able to respectfully, the way he puts it is, don't assume that people who have different views of you are necessarily bad.
Sure.
And don't assume that somebody who has different arguments from you necessarily has bad arguments. Weigh the arguments. Don't make it a personal thing. Well, Joe Biden, he's a Democrat. To hell with whatever he says. No, if he makes a good argument, accept it. And the same for Donald. Donald Trump, like him or not, can make a good argument.
He can. Absolutely.
And maybe just let's wind back up to go to immigration. If there's one issue that he has raised into popular consciousness, it's been the issue of immigration.
Yes.
Now, I'm not personally very satisfied with some of the solutions that he's offered, but the fact that he's gotten support in some ways indicates that this was an issue where people were not listening. People were saying there's a problem, and maybe people in Washington were saying there's not. Right. So we can learn even from individuals that we might be totally in disagreement with, politically.
Right.
They have a different party label, maybe from a red state versus a blue state or vice versa. But we've got to get back to communicating with one another. And I think our viewers know that this is what we're trying to do here.
Absolutely.
Right? This is not a red state or a blue state, a Democrat or Republican. We're trying to assess issues. And the way I assess them, take them for what they're worth. If I make a good argument, fine. If I just make an assertion, call us out on it.
And we appreciate the comments that we're getting.
Absolutely.
We appreciate the ones especially that are saying, okay, here's my argument, versus the ones that are extremely dismissive of, well, I just disagree. Well, it's,
don't swat me.
Right, okay. Then,
just tell us the argument.
Right, then give us something extra. We really appreciate those, as, whatever our opinions are. It's good to hear the back and forth versus just the name calling. I don't like those. We don't name call here. We don't appreciate it or stand for it. So it's, we're not looking for people to name call or to judge us simply on one opinion or something, but to open the avenues, just like you're saying, to open the avenues, to open the thought process, to open the ideas of, from a legal standpoint, from a political standpoint, knowing the Constitution and the law, what does it seem to say? What are the arguments on each side? Whether, whatever our opinions are, we try very hard to present them in the best possible light for either side, with our opinion as to which one would work. Not necessarily which one is best, but which one's based on the law that we know and the Constitution that we have seems appropriate based on history.
And so usually, I don't know, you ever you do sort of give warnings, right, that you shouldn't drink the whole bottle of wine.
I try, please don't.
I cannot figure out if I'm particularly wound up today because we have so many issues, or because it's my first experience.
You may not want to drink the whole thing.
Well, I almost have to at this point, right? The fizz will go out of it if I do not.
It will. You either just have to throw it away or finish it up. That's hilarious. I'm gonna.
But only 10 calories, so that you would think. But maybe
it's not a sugar high. It's the caffeine.
Well, is it caffeine? It says it's.
Oh, it's caffeine.
Oh, it's caffeine.
There's got to be caffeine in there. The Celsius, I have some, and they tell you. I think they actually tell you on a warning to not drink more than 2 a day.
Okay, well, I know. What is it? The Panera Bread?
Oh my goodness, the charged lemonades.
They've
talk about a legal issue.
2 people who have. Well, talk about a legal issue. let's go to Boeing. Yes.
Oh my gosh, Boeing, Panera, all of this. Yes.
Yeah, you're in a plane, and all of a sudden, a hunk of the plane the size of a refrigerator sort of pops out, and your cell phone goes with it. I mean, talk about an indignity. Yeah. Imagine losing your cell phone
in an airplane.
In an airplane. Right.
I have to tell a quick funny story, and then we'll wrap it up for those of you who are probably already dropped off by now. But anyway, one of the funniest stories I remember in high school, my very first airplane ride. We went with a band trip. You'll recall this to Hawaii. You guys were so sweet to save up enough money so that we could go on this trip. And we were flying. We were not the only ones in the airplane who had never flown before. It was a huge trip.
And I suspect that I had hyped up.
Oh, probably so. Probably so. But one of our friends figured out not only were we new flyers, but there was an older couple in front of us who was also flying for the first time. And it's funny now, but how terrifying it was, especially to this couple, because all of a sudden the guy looks out and he's like, "What happened to our wing?" And we looked over, we're like, "What?" And he's like, "Are they supposed to fall off like that?" And I just remember this poor couple's face of sheer terror. I mean, I was already concerned, but at least I knew these guys. Well, but yeah, anyway.
Back in the day, they arrest somebody, somebody's at the airport, and they say, "Hi, Jack," and the next thing you know, they're carrying him away. Potential threat. So the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Exactly. Well, Dr. File, thank you so much for joining us to kick off our new year for 2024. We have got such a year ahead of us in law and politics, and I'm excited to share it with you. Happy New Year.
And to you.
Click like and subscribe.
And watch the energy drinks.
Yeah, watch those. The bubbly is pretty good.
I may not sleep for another week.
Don't call me at 11.
Okay.
I do also like to sleep. But anyway, thank you so much. It is good to see you. Happy New Year. And we will catch you next time on the Legal Weekly Wine.